Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Before we start with Michael, but it's a big year of us, it's the last SPREE seminar, so the hero of this seminar is Rob. Not everyone knows him, but this is Rob, and all this SPREE seminar is recorded, and Rob put a lot of effort. So maybe first of all, let's say thanks Rob for his effort. Thank you, Rob. You are amazing. Oliver did a great job with me this year because I usually put more the science, and Oliver pushed that we will change a bit the direction to climate change. So a lot of the ideas, yeah. So thank you, Oliver. Some of them was great suggestion. Michael was also pushed by Oliver that found him much before me. So now we can start with the presentation of today. So the best way to finish the year, we thought, is like with someone like Michael West, that if you follow his website, you know how great he is. So Michael has 20 years of experience in journalism, mostly on the financial world, I think. But then 2 years ago, he started his 2016, I think, yeah?
April 2016, yeah.
He started his website, and it's a great website. It's a great website that really gives you the real information that you want to have on different issues, like climate change and global warming. I think that's something that's close to all of us. So we always think that part of the problem is that the media not always reflect the problem, but I think that Michael is one of the way to solve the problem. As a person that gives you accurate information, good information. So, Michael, thank you very much for coming here. You study at UNSW, so welcome home.
Thank you very much.
He's now associate professor at Sydney University, but maybe one day hopefully we'll back here. So, thank you very much for coming, and we're looking forward to hear you. So, please welcome, yes, Anna? Yeah. Thank you, Anna. Okay. Let's welcome Michael.
Well, thank you very much for coming, everybody, and thank you, Zif. I appreciate that. It's a great privilege to be able to speak in front of people. I'm not very good at it, so I thought I might just have a ramble for a while and then throw it open to questions, because people can then sort of hone in on the issues which they're really interested in. Adani, of course, is the brand name for the talk, because it's so redolent of what's wrong with politics and of what's wrong with the relationships between big business and government and so on, that really cut voters and ordinary people out of the process. And Adani, my first association was working for the Herald and the Age. It was about 2013, about 5 years ago, when I came across this Adani story, a bit of a minor scoop. I ran it, not thinking what kind of audience it would attract, and it got readership within the first day of 100,000 people. It was huge. A lot of overseas readers as well. I thought, well, this is really interesting. This Adani's a fantastic story. And now you find that journalists know this, so that's why there's so many Adani stories. The Guardian does one a day, because people know that there's immense interest in this, globally as well. After a year of keeping it on the radar, I got a call from a German journalist, works for a major publication over there, who's an investigative journalist, and he came out here and he wanted some contacts to go and see regarding Adani, to work out why the blazes Australia was permitting this development to happen, the world's biggest new thermal coal mine project. There are bigger ones, but this is the biggest new one. Doesn't make sense from an economic perspective, because it floods the market with cheap, low-grade coal. Doesn't make any sense from an environmental perspective. It's a disaster from the point of view of emissions, as everybody will know. And by the way, I'm taking the basic standpoint here of assumed knowledge that climate change is real. Many people in the media don't share that position, unfortunately, in one particular section of the media. Well, I used to work for 8 years. It was a very difficult place to work if you held iconoclastic views like climate change being real. But in any case, it makes no sense either from a water perspective. Water is very precious inland Queensland, just like everywhere else in Australia. And these free water licences, which the state government has just lavished, the biggest in Australian corporate history, on this one company, doesn't make sense from that perspective either. It really is, and from Australia's reputational perspective, it makes no sense. You crush the price of your own major export, and I think it's coal and iron ore are basically level pegging at the moment as Australia's biggest exports. Coal, of course, the price has shot back up, so now we're earning about as much by dollar value as much for our coal exports as our iron ore exports. So it's of huge value to Australia. There's huge, gigantic vested interest in the fossil fuel industry, and that's where you get this potent push. Now, in the years when I first started writing about it, the banks vanished. Commonwealth Bank used to be the number one. It was the project financier, basically. It was the head bank in the syndicate. It finally walked away in about 2015, just threw its hands up, because the green movement is much better organised than it used to be. Excellent people like Tim Buckley at IEFA and these kind of people were going to see investors, bank investors, all the big institutions that were the shareholders of the Commonwealth Bank and other banks, and basically saying, we will protest and we will publicly expose you if you invest in this. Finally, the Commonwealth Bank went, it's Australia's biggest investor in coal, by the way, but it said, we won't back Adani. It walked away, so Adani had no banks. Then for many years, next couple of years, this project was just not economically viable. It needs a coal price, the thermal coal price of about $100 a tonne. The futures price fell to $62 a tonne, I think in 2015, 2016. So it was 50%. It needed the coal price to double to make it work. The other thing about the Adani mine is it's not high quality coal, despite the PR. You've got this schism between the PR, great quality coal, fantastic for jobs, and the reality. Not 10,000 jobs, 1,400 jobs, poor quality, high sulphur coal, not a great export, and an export which will crush the prices. Even the Glencore chief executive, Peter Frydenberg's come out against it. So you've got to look at this project and go, why? And people often ask me that question. I've written stories about it, just trying to say, well, why, if it doesn't make sense? Well, the price has now gone back up to $100, $110, $15 a tonne. So now you would have to say it's viable just on today's spot prices. The futures will be a bit below that, but it's economically viable. But that doesn't really matter because this is an integrated thing, and the buyer is Adani Power, and they're just feeding their own coal plants back in India. There is some suggestion that it'll go to Pakistan because Adani won't need this coal. They're expanding rapidly in India in renewable energy, wind and solar. In fact, they've got other projects here. They've got a massive solar project in near the border of, I think, South Australia and Northern Territory. So they're hedging their bets everywhere. So to get back to that question, why? If it doesn't make environmental sense, it doesn't make political sense, because this is going to be an anvil around the neck of whichever government gives this one the approval. This is going to last for many years. It will be protested heavily. I've always taken the view, and I'll stick to it, even though sometimes you feel as though it's inevitable, because the rhetoric is it's going to happen, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. The Courier Mail, the Australia, not jobs, jobs, jobs. I still don't think it will happen. They've scaled down their plans now from the original 16 billion tonnes per annum down to 3 proposal. Well, sorry, 3 billion, not tonnes per annum, $3 billion project cost. So we do a slimmed down version of it. Now that's what they're saying, because they simply can't get the project financed because the banks don't want to touch it. They still haven't got it. They keep on saying it's going to start, but no banks will give them the finance. I think for two reasons. One, because it's just, they can see the cost of new renewables is lower now than the cost of new coal. It's a basic proposition. Why would you invest in a sunset industry like this, which will end up being stranded assets? and because of the protesting. You know, I think people can see that they've got a long tail risk, these bankers, down the track, that people are going to maybe even take them to court and sue them for making decisions when they knew at the time that this would have an adverse impact, and they still went and gave it finance. So I still don't think it will happen. And the one gauge of that is the last false dawn. A few weeks ago, there was a story in the Queensland papers, it's all ready to go, here we go. So I rang up a couple of contacts and I said, look, is there any sign that they're putting on any engineers for this project? Because of course you need 100, 200 engineers just to start getting serious about it. Huge project. No sign. They haven't put an ad in the paper yet. So no engineers. So it's just fluff in the media really, the Murdoch media saying, you know, this is going to start. It's giving it that psychological impetus. So the other point about the jobs is their own expert witnesses said many years ago now in a suit in a Queensland court that the amount of jobs created would be, on their own internal modelling and everything like that, was 1,400 odd jobs. But the politicians, particularly the coal boosters in the National Liberal parties have constantly maintained it's 10,000 jobs. And some people have made even more extravagant claims. But the company's own forecasts are 1,400. And I think if you read, there's always telltale signs too. If you read a trade magazine, somebody sent me a clipping from a trade magazine dealing with the engineering issues of the mine and stuff like that, with one of the Adani more junior executives boasting that automation had got to such a stage where this was going to be just pit to port, no labour at all needed. And there's a photograph of a machine saying this machine is going to basically get us out of having to employ anybody. You know, so, you know, there's a lot of misinformation running around. Now, despite all this, the government behind the scenes has been pushing a number of things. I've written broken stories about both these things. One is the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund, which is basically it's a bit of a slush fund for coal, some people believe, but it does have some worthy project ideas. And it is supposed to be considering financing the rail line from the Carmichael project through to Abbott Point on the coast. And the other one is, and this is one that I had to ask 100 questions to get there and got stonewalled and told lies, and that's EFIC. There's an outfit called the Export Finance Investment Corporation, and it's a government body. And EFIC is meant to help export industries. And so you go along to EFIC, you've got an export business, and you say, can you give us some finance for this, or provide guarantees for our loans, just some help. And anyway, there's EFIC behind the scenes, working with the government on proposals to put taxpayers' money behind this ridiculous proposal. And so you've got NAIF, the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund, considering putting up $900 million, $1 billion for the rail line alone. But of course the loan's not worth anything if the project goes belly up because it's not viable. That's $1 billion of taxpayers' money there, and who knows what EFIC is up to. They're too secretive. We may not know till their annual report comes out next year. So you've got these government agencies behind the scenes being prodded, obviously, by political interference by people like Steve Ciobo, who was the Trade Minister at the time, the Minister supervising EFIC. He's moved on to Defence now, but certainly the government the Liberal government's been giving it every prod it can. The Labor government has been rather cowardly, although politically quite, I think, probably tactful. Its position is, officially, they support the mine. They don't want to be wedged politically, and this is the reason the thing's still alive, because they don't want to come out and say, no, we don't support that idea, it's ridiculous. One, because they've got the unions. A lot of unions oppose it, mind you, but there are unions which back it. And the other thing is because it's just the old politics. They don't want to be wedged as being anti-jobs. So what will happen if they came up publicly in Queensland Parliament every day? It will be this pointing the bone across the chamber saying, you're anti-Queensland, you're anti-jobs, wrapping themselves in the flag kind of behaviour. And that is really what I believe. I believe Labor just thinks it's going to die because it's not vulnerable, so they don't want to come out. They'll just let it die. So their position has been, we won't put government money behind it. So it's not as courageous as the Greens' position, which has been vehemently against it. But of course, the Greens don't get donations from unions or corporations. So they're in a better position, less conflict position to be able to tell the truth about it. So I think it's being wedged on jobs is the absolute central reason why politically this thing is still alive. Now, from Adani's point of view, why would a billionaire, you don't become a billionaire because you just, you're lucky. He's had projects all his life and he's been used to suborning governments and basically schmoozing politicians and aggressive business tactics. Why would he, if it's not feasible? Why would he back it? Why would he still be pushing for it? Well, it's another good question. I've thought about this at length and I've written about it too, but the reason is his greatest personal family exposure to this project is in two places. If you look at, he's got this very complex labyrinthine structure which winds back, he's got two of them. One which winds back to Mauritius and I think the Caribbean, another one which goes to the Cayman Islands. One is attached to the port facilities because he owns the port facilities which are now operating at Abbott Point. Now, if the coal gets developed and it comes down on the train and goes out through the port, the family of Gautam Adani will benefit because they clip the ticket on every tonne of coal because they're a port operator. That's how they get paid. That particular corporate structure has no exposure to the price of coal or to mine development risk or to any particular risks. There's probably just port risk. So his family personally benefits from that, and if you follow it back, you get to tax havens in the Caribbean. So you've got to ask yourself, again, what is the government doing? Providing, approving for a project structure where it ends up in the Cayman Islands, and this is a project which has been financed by Australian taxpayers. I mean, they're just taking us all for granted, aren't they? They're really pulling the leg. The other one is the rail project. Now, obviously, Gina Rinehart and other people that have got assets in that region that can be developed at some point, they're all behind it too politically. They want the project to go ahead, the rail line to be built at a cost, funded by taxpayers. Now, the structure which Adani, like the port structure, it's a separate one, but the structure he has set up for the rail also goes back to tax havens, to his personal family interests in other countries, in tax havens. So the way the rail works is like the port. They get the government to buy to provide the infrastructure. We all pay for taxes, and then they just clip the ticket on every tonne of coal that goes through the system. And so they don't take any risk. The rail gets built, the government, that's all taxpayer risk, taxpayer money. They don't have any risk because it doesn't matter about the price. They'll just clip the ticket on every tonne of coal that goes through. So port and rail, the Adani family interests are just there for, it's a perfect business. It's just, if the coal comes through, we charge for every tonne of coal that goes through. That doesn't go to Adani Power or Adani Enterprises, the listed companies on the Indian share market. That goes to, via a very complicated, Byzantine structure, back to tax havens. And so that is their reason. So Gautam Adani is just basically, he's playing a long game. He's just going, well, I'm just going to sit here and wait for these maddies, the people like Canavan and all the right-wing coal guys, to keep on pushing and pushing for taxpayers' money to be used. to develop this thing. And if that happens, and it does get developed, he has no risk. He's not going to lose. The banks take the loss if the project falls apart. The taxpayers take the loss. The environment takes the loss for remediation, etc. So the worst case scenario is that they build the mine and the whole market just collapses as it looks like, you know, there are a lot of stranded assets around now, and we're left with a gigantic hole in the ground, and that's it. And that's a possibility if it goes ahead. So I remain convinced it's not going to go ahead, but I just think I wish there was some public understanding of the fact that taxpayers are taking all the risk, and this guy is just waiting for the governments to give him everything possible to make this thing work, so that he can clip the ticket and his profits go straight back to a tax haven, to his personal family companies. And that's the way it is. Now, this stuff here, I spoke about this the other day, and I just guess this is kind of what I developed as my thing in journalism since I got sacked from Fairfax a couple of years ago for the crime of journalism. So I basically did Corporatocracy, which is looking at the relationships between big corporations and government. So I've been tracking and building databases on things like, you know, donations, revolving doors, so the people going between industry and government, on government spending, and on lobbyists. I went out and had a look at all the lobby groups, the main ones in Australia. We'd all have a stab at what they are. Of course, the resources industry is massive. The Minerals Council, which is the Adani project, benefits minerals because that's coal. The specific coal peak bodies were wrapped in the Minerals Council a few years ago. Their annual budget, when they were getting rid of the resources rent tax and Kevin Rudd in the process, that went to $30 million a year. So during that time, back around 2009, 2010, just this one peak body, the peak body for resources, the Minerals Council, $32, $34 million a year in funding. And that saw that TV campaign many of you might remember about how Aussie, how un-Australian it was to oppose, to try and tax these poor miners. I mean, the reality is that the members of the Minerals Council are all majority foreign owned. BHP, 70%, shareholders offshore, 80%, Rio Tinto, Glencore, 100%. They're the big three that were the real movers and the shakers. So that gives you an idea about one peak body. You look at the next one, even bigger and better funded, it's a thing called APIA, which is oil and gas. Now, many of your students and many engineers will end up in this industry, so I feel slightly sheepish about coming here to an engineering lecture and bagging them all, but my point is that I think there should be public understanding about money and politics and so on. And this APIA, the Australian Petroleum Producers and Exploration Association, they're about $12 to $15 million a year funding. That's Exxon, BHP, Shell, BP, Woodside, and so on. That's the really big one. There is only one bigger peak body than that. Does anyone have a guess at what Australia's biggest favourite industry is? It's $20 million a year these guys are funded, and it's the Property Council. So that's why any effort at property reform, negative gearing or whatever it is, runs into an absolute, titanium wall. There's a lot of vested interest. It's a huge sector. So the Property Council is about $20 million a year. So between them, this is the handful. And then if you start to go and have a look at Big Pharma, that's Medicines Australia and every one of these companies has their own in-house PR and lobbying capability as well. They use external specialist firms who have particular relationships with government and with government ministers and with bureaucrats in order to get their own way. And I see one of the audience members, Rosie Mobbs, will have heard this because I mentioned it the other night in a public forum, but the best example I can give of this, because people say, oh look, there's a donation or there's no donation, that must have been, it's just not as simple as that at all. But this lobbying thing is really, it can be quite insidious, because you've got about $1 billion a year, is my best guess, in lobbying firms, peak bodies, associations, external firms in Australia. It's $1 billion industry. And I've gone and looked at the financial statements of all these majors, 20 of them. I got to 670 million in income, usually from members. Some of them even get grants from government, funnily enough. And so I estimate it's got to be $1 billion just in lobbying. That's people whose job it is to swing the opinions of politicians and so on. Now that's got to be a few $1 million per politician, federal politician. And if you consider what people do for a living, journalists get news and they write it, and academics teach and they do research, and what do lobbyists, or dentists, they fix people's teeth, they work on people's teeth all day. Well, what does a lobbyist do? It works trying to swing the opinion of politicians to legislate in their favour all day. That's what they do. They come up with campaigns and so on. And so there's a lot of money in it. And the other one that I've been building a database on is the revolving doors. And if you look at some of these big projects, there was a classic one the other day, the guy that sold the port of Darwin to the Chinese, Andrew Robb. Next thing you know, he retires from politics to seek exciting opportunities elsewhere. And where does he end up? The Chinese people that he just sold the port of Darwin to. So, I mean, there's got to be something done about this sort of stuff. You know, there has to be legislation. There's got to be change around donations and around disclosure and all this stuff, because it's not good enough that the rest of Australia, the 26 million of us, or what adults, I guess it's, 13 or 14 million, go out to vote once every 3 years to have our say, and that's the one say that we have. And the rest of the time, somebody else is running the show. And I think really, in the case of Adani, you know, there's a lot of this behind the scene stuff going on, a lot of misinformation. It's not helped by the fact that the Murdoch press, which has a monopoly on the main newspapers in every city, particularly Courier Mail is the only one in Queensland, and Sky News, of course, that they basically have been resolute boosters, champions of this thing from the very start. You won't find anybody writing anti-Adani. I think Alan Kohler did have a bit of a shot, just to give him his dues. He had a bit of a crack at it at one point. But you won't find any other journalists in the entire Murdoch empire, which owns most of the Queensland regional papers, saying a bad word. All you will hear is what a marvellous project it is, and of course you'll get the climate scepticism sort of laced throughout the copy, and you get Sky News, you know, slapping the tub every night about how climate change isn't real and this kind of thing. So really, when you've got 70% of the traditional media, the press, in those hands, and just this Leviathan, climate change denial, coal boosting thing, the media has quite a bit to explain. Of course, the ABC, if they start doing stuff that's too racy, they get sat on with complaints. They've got a very difficult complaints process because it's effectively public service, so they've got all sorts of hoops they've got to jump through there. So they have the threat of self-censorship. Fairfax increasingly beholden to the corporate dollar. Any business where the revenue's shrinking, more reliant on the revenue they've still got. And then independent media sort of growing, and social media growing, and of course on Twitter, if you've got an Adani story on Twitter, it just goes off. It's hotcakes on Twitter, you know. But, you know, that doesn't get through to the whole population. So you do have a media problem, and I think that's, if the Murdoch press had taken a rational or even balanced view on this thing would be gone years ago, because there'd be none of this nonsense about politicians wanting to put our money, our taxpayers' money, on the line for a project that doesn't stack up environmentally, economically, and morally even. And that's about it. So
anyone wants to ask any questions about all this stuff?
Is there any country in the world, Sweden, Finland, or somewhere that is actually not like this?
In terms of caving into pressure from vested interests? I think Australia, I haven't lived permanently in any other countries, but Australia, I think, because this is such a fossil fuels in particular, because it's such a large part of our economic base, we're particularly vulnerable to it. And I also think some other countries like Norway has taken a very good view on this, and that all that wealth from their North Sea oil operations, a lot of that has gone into their sovereign wealth fund. So they've provided for their future. Unfortunately, in Australia, we haven't done that. The super cycle, the big boom, just banging out the door. And companies like Glencore, they $15 billion a year in revenue, paying zero income tax, go straight to Switzerland or via Caribbean or whatever. But you've had an incredible flow of profits from resources going offshore and very little captured here. And when they did try to capture something, Kevin Rudd had a crack at the PRRT. No, it wasn't PRRT. It was MR. It was the resources rent tax, RSPT or what? RSPT, I think it was. So many acronyms after all these years. Then it became the MRRT. But the Rudd proposal, which cost him his job, was quite a strong tax that would have captured a bit of revenue. As it was, when he went, and Gillard and Swan just basically wanted to stay in power, and they did quite a weak transaction. That transaction, I think, and many people say, it actually benefited the mining companies because they pulled things like depreciation, special depreciation deals and so on, so they actually made a profit out of that negotiation. They got rid of the big, bad, nasty increased tax, and they actually managed to con the government into giving them some depreciation break. So a couple of years where the profits were big during the super cycle, they got exemptions from, somehow it boosted their profits.
Another question, how does money get to Matt Canavan type people promoting this sort of stuff, right? There's many of them. Are they paid a bonus on the fact that it goes ahead, or they just get paid some money anyway?
I don't. Well, obviously in a public forum, you don't want to speculate too much, and I think actual corruption is not. It's not really how it works. Look, I'm sure there are people out there that are getting. I mean, with the LNG thing in Queensland, I think there's been quite a bit of actual corruption, politicians buying properties in certain zones which are going to be developed, etc. That hasn't come out in the mainstream media. Generally, Swiss bank accounts and things, I'm sure it happens, but I don't think it's as widespread. I think these people literally are true believers. And I think people get wedged ideologically into going, lefties or right people, and they hate the other side, and coal's good, and I think it's just, want to be part of the gang, like school kids. They don't want to be left out, and there's the coal gang, and it's Abbott and Canavan and these guys, and I think they probably truly believe that it's a good thing. I'm not convinced. It's hard to put yourself in that mind, put yourself in somebody else's shoes, but I don't think it's personal corruption. I think it's people truly believe that all the lefties and the greenies are wrong, and they lump everybody, including the 90 scientists from the IPCC report from 40 countries. So they're all just, that's just their opinion.
It's almost like a mental health issue.
Yes.
Michael, thanks. Great presentation. But that $30 million you're talking about, that's going somewhere. One way or another, it must be turning up in the political coffers.
The 30 million from?
But you were talking about the lobbying money that you were talking about, that the 20 million that the Property Council has, the 30 million that the Minerals Council...
Oh yeah, well no, that goes to their campaigns. I mean, they pay these people a lot of money.
Okay, but that money's going somewhere, someone's benefiting from that, so you mightn't call that direct corruption like you say, but it's corrupting the process in my mind. The big question in my mind though is, what's in it for News Corp? What are they getting out of this that they're so pro fossil fuels and so anti-Adani?
Well, I worked there for 8 years as a columnist, so I've got a fair insight into the News Corp psyche. And what they do, the way to get ahead at News Corp is to be basically to second guess Rupert. So once you're an editor, you've really got to second guess what they want higher up the chain. It's all about second guessing. There's no memo. When the Iraq War happened, I was there, and everybody was expected to call it the liberation of Iraq rather than the invasion. Our language is very powerful, and it didn't come around in a memo. Don't call it the, you know, and so people like myself, troublemakers or real journalists, we just continued to call it, you know, the invasion and took no notice. But as a result of that, I lost my prime spot on the back page of the Australian newspaper. I was buried inside and was never run off the front again, and was sort of persona non grata in management, so just simply for journalism, you know, and that's the way it works. You see the people that are promoted there, that get all the airtime, the talent, you know, they wouldn't be considered talent anywhere else, but they're talent there because they're prepared. Well, the classic one was yesterday, Judith Sloan. It came out that she's paid $350,000 a year to write a column or two for the Oz. Ross Gittins will be on will be on 100,000 less than that. $350,000. Now she writes what they want to hear, and Terry McCrown does the same. You know, he'd be on $500,000 probably.
What's your opinion on the new $7 billion mega coal mine that got approved by the state government right next door to Adani using the same railroad?
Which one?
It's called the China Stone Thermal Coal Project.
Whereabouts?
It's in Queensland as well. The Queensland.
In the same.
This wasn't last week's news yet.
Oh yeah. I don't.
The same railroad.
I haven't had a look at it, but I guess that if they're using the same railroad, that gives more impetus to the idea that the rail will be built because there are other projects. But you know, if it's thermal coal, I take it. Yeah. Well, you know, my view will be the same. That is there any point in developing more coal assets? Not from an environmental point of view, but just an economic point of view. I mean, this is, at the moment, the price is quite high. You know, it's doubled in 3 years. But why would you crush the export price of seaborne thermal coal when it's one of our biggest exports anyway by creating more supply? I think it's bizarre. And look, frankly, if private enterprise and the banks want to get behind something and do it, that's another thing. That's another argument. But the problem with Adani is, I'm not sure about this one, I'd like to see what little, you know, side deals there have been here. I haven't had a good look at it. I must go and have a look. Yeah, I must have a look and ask a couple of people about it. I've been buried on other things, but I mean, you've got to wonder if politicians are putting taxpayer dollars behind something, you know, like this idea that let's build another coal-fired power plant. You know, I mean, it's bizarre. The last one was built in 2003. That was subsidised back then by government. And so why would you put taxpayer, when there's companies building renewables projects off their own bat with little or no subsidy? And it's cheaper to build new renewable energy than new coal. So it doesn't make sense anymore. So it's fallen into this culture wars thing, you know, that happens in other areas besides fossil fuels, but culture wars, it's just a real thing. And it's tribal politics. And I see the carbon tax has just come back. Let's reignite it. It worked last time. Let's bring back the carbon tax fear campaign again. So I think the next election next year we're going to see, if in fact it's not it's not quicker than that, we're going to see carbon tax, we're going to see property price, house scare. They're going to be the big ones.
Michael, thanks a lot for your talk and also for your work for years in this area. We're indebted to you. This might be an impossible question, but it relates to the question about politicians and Rob's question about Murdoch. Some of these people who are pro-coal, anti-renewables, climate change skeptics or deniers are quite smart people. Have you got any thoughts on how it is that they manage to convince themselves that expert advice by the great body of scientists is wrong and that they're right? I mean, have you got any thoughts on that?
Again, it goes back to the previous answer I just gave. I think people believe what they want to believe, and they use whatever, they cherry pick whatever evidence is out there to support their theory. So it's willful blindness, I think, mostly. I think on the part of some people, it's simply a career move. They know it's probably nonsense, but they choose to ignore it. They don't look at the actual facts. They come at it with their presupposed point of view. So I think some of it could be just media corruption. I think it's a good deal of it. I think people just go, look, I'm going to get ahead if I write this nonsense. And they do. They're paid twice. You know. I mean, it's not just. I mean, the commercial TV stations haven't gone near Adani either. If you've noticed that, they don't go near corporate things much. The ABC's got a ball and chain around its ankles. They can have a big crack sometimes on Four Corners, which is fantastic, and 7:30 does a good job. But generally, they've really got, and then they've got to get the balance. They've got to go to that side and give equal time to that side. You know, even with climate change, 99% of the world's scientists, they've still got to go and get and just cover off on the deniers. But I think it's just from talking. I know some of these people, and reasonably on good terms with some of them, and the crazy right-wingers, and it's a mixture of career and just willful blindness, just wanting to, and it's packaging it all up, like you're not a true conservative unless you just like you're not a true lefty unless you believe all that, that kind of thing. I think it comes as a bit of a package deal. And I think that's really unfortunate, that whole tribal thing, because you've really got a big centre of politics which people could appeal to in Australia, rational people that will listen to either side of the argument, and that's a big voter base, and that's why the Libs are in troubles at the moment. There's too much craziness on the fringe.
Just leading on from that question, I think that fake news is going to be a real problem in our generation, especially with social media, as you can see it already. People are more and more divided. What do you see the future of journalism, especially in terms of environment? Do you think that independent journalism will continue to grow, or do you think we'll see legislation coming out against fake news?
Yeah, great question. Well, right at the moment, there's no business model for independent journalism. There's a bit in the US. I mean, ProPublica and there's a few that get ICIJ, that get, I think it's Open Secrets. So there's some good things in the US. It's a big market, 300 million people. So there are, and they've got a charitable tradition there, which we haven't got here. People give their money away. There's a lot more money, a lot more people. So you've got a big market. So you do have some quality independent journalism over there. Over here it's hard. I'm the only one doing what I do, and I've had to, I wouldn't say personal hardship and tears and gnashing of teeth, but I've been threatened by big corporations with lawsuits. I've been bullied by Murdoch a few times, which I love, because every time I get bullied by Murdoch, I get more subscriptions to the website, you see, so, which is always good. So I sort of bait them the whole time to try to encourage them to have a crack. I hope they're listening to this talk right at the moment. They might have another go. But now they know that I quite like it, that they don't want to bully me anymore. So there's no model. My model is I'm not going to put up a paywall because nobody would read it. So I just put the hand out and say, back me like the local footy team, And I've got enough to get by myself, but I can't grow from there until there's some other business model, because you've still got ad revenue shrinking. I mean, I was at Fairfax, business editor, when the yield on an internet ad fell by about 90%. Because a newspaper ad, in the old newspaper when everyone read them, was turn of the century was, say, $10,000, $15,000 for a full page. When the internet came in, it was much cheaper. And of course, everybody thought, oh, this is going to be great because you can target them and everything like this, and they can come up across platforms, and there's so much flexibility, and you can literally target. How annoying it is when you're looking at something on the internet, and somehow then you've got bang, all these travel things come up, or what you've been looking at. But that targeting was supposed to be good. That's gone because internet yields for Fairfax and news, etc., went from, say, $1,000 for whatever to $100. That just got butchered in about 2 years. And suddenly they realise can't make any money out of ads either. They can make a little bit. And, you've really got to sacrifice the integrity of your product to do that. You've got to
be prepared to get hit with that noisy video and the ad when you're looking up a story, etc. So it's invasive. There's no business model at the moment. They're going to have to, I think, to address the rest of your question, they're going to have to open up DGR status so people sort of can become a charitable thing, so you can get paid. I mean, you know, all these think tanks get, you know, a charity status or DGR status, which is your tax breaks if you give to them, including the IPA, TAI on the left. So I think independent journalism is going to have to go that way as well. I don't think subscription works, frankly. I mean, if you notice just what's happened in this week, you know, Crikey, New Matilda and one other of the Monthly, I think it is, or Crikey and the Monthly and one other of somehow merging, doing some packet merge. So there's pressure just going on everywhere. Sole operators, if you've got a particular niche like me and a few people throwing a bit of money your way, you can get by. But you can be wiped out at any moment by a lawsuit too. So, you know, there is no model. I noticed Judith Nielsen, Keir Nielsen's wife, former wife, has just come out and pledged $100 million this week to independent journalism. She's, you know, they made a lot of money through selling through the Platinum asset management business, and they're philanthropic people, and I think they've just taken the view there is a real problem. We got a lot of money. We're going to put $100 million this way, so there'll be bees swarming around that little old honey pot, that's for sure.
Thanks very much, Michael. It was really informative. I just wanted to get your opinion on how the average Australian might be able to contribute to addressing the issue of the power of lobbyists, and what kind of future we could have if that lobbying process is not in place.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question. I think transparency is the issue. And donations, apparently political donations, for instance, they capture about 10-20% publicly, and it's an 18-month lag until sometimes a year. It's big. So whatever they're bribing people to do now, we won't know about it for 18 months, you know, or a year. So you've got a problem there. You've got a problem with them routing it through different state branches, and the political parties don't have to produce transparent company accounts, so you can't see who's doing transactions with it. There's real reporting problems. Lobbying register, everyone's getting around that too. I think there's just got to be real transparency. That's what I've been trying to do, get data people to, build up a database with the revolving doors. It's on the website at the moment. I've just done fossil fuels. I want to do in banking and so on. So if you're a politician, you're just about to buzz off to whoever you've just been regulating, then you know you're going to be on this thing and your photograph is going to be on it, and you can be responsible and accountable for your decision. Not necessarily saying it's a criminal act or anything, but you know, you have got to that position through the good grace of the public, voting you into power, and then you've gone to earn money personally out of that, so let's be accountable. Donations got to be much more accountable, lobbying much more, and there's not much work being done around that because it's all backroom stuff. And frankly, it's kind of like if you're a minister, you've got a team, a staff down there in Canberra, right? Now, you know, on your staff, because politicians don't get much time, right? They're pretty busy. So they rely on what other people are telling them all the time. And if they got people around them, I mean, for instance, the lobbyists are based in Canberra, probably people in their 30s and 40s with kids that might go to the childcare with the staffers' kids or see them at the Brumbies game on the weekend or whatever it is. You know, it's a small town, and it's these personal relationships which inform people's opinions, and how you stop that. And of course, in a pluralist democracy, people should be able to have their say. If their job is to advocate for whatever, and it's not all bad. In the case of Pharma, I mean, Pharma just gets away with blue murder. Such huge, sophisticated lobbying operations. And the cost of the PBS has gone up from $7 billion to, it's going to be $12 billion this year. This is in 5 or 6 years, maybe a little bit longer. 7 years maybe. That's huge. That hasn't been, it's been underreported. And of course, some things, how can you say, oh, they've just put this thing on the PBS, it's going to cost taxpayers $400 million a year. Oh, taxpayers, that's bad. But look,
It's just probably saved a few people's lives. So it's not always, you know, it's not black and white. This is the problem with a lot of this stuff. And you can put your hand on your heart and you can say, look, I was a lobbyist that got that drug registered and I saved that child's life because they wouldn't have been able to afford it otherwise. So these things are never black and white. And everybody, it goes to the other question about justifying your own behaviour by cherry-picking convenient facts. We'll do that. I do it as a journalist, you know. You're always saying, oh, I've got public right to know and all this sort of stuff. And terrible crimes have been committed in the name of the public's right to know, you know, by some journalists. You know, it's just transparency is it. It was with multinational tax avoidance, which has been one of my big ones. It was all about just getting this out there in the public domain and people suddenly realising, oh, so that's what it's about. And once everyone realises, they realise that, hang on, I earned 100,000, these guys earn 100 million, and I pay more tax than they did. And people just go, oh, geez, that's just wrong. And suddenly the whole thing changes. And they've brought in $5 billion government coffers since 2015, following that Senate inquiry into corporate tax avoidance, because people suddenly got onto it. So public understanding is a huge part of all this.
Are you familiar with the governance or the sort of obligations of MPs to their constituents? Because you talk about them taking us for granted, but you know, like if you could show that a majority of a particular electorate were against a decision they were making, I don't know, like I mean I don't know enough about it, but forming those tribal pacts in Parliament, surely that would diffuse some of their ability to kind of serve you know, I don't know if you know what I'm trying to get at.
I do, and I think Twitter sort of does that a bit. I think they get a bit of an idea, but of course they have party solidarity is a big thing, isn't it? So if you've got to vote really with your party, so it's a problem with the system. But you're right, I mean a lot of decisions the government make, if you were to go and ask the electorate, oh, what do you think about this decision? They would disagree with the decision that their elected representative makes. But I guess their argument would be, well, our job is to be elected and do the work on your behalf, and people don't agree on everything, and so and you know, you've elected us to do this job and so on. I think social media is identifying a lot of that, and there is the problem with fake news, of course, which has been, you know, well telegraphed, but you know, but ultimately people are going to be more sophisticated. They're going to know what's fake and what's not. And I think probably the rise of social media, which gives people an instantaneous say, it's just very difficult to know the way it's going to play out at this point. I mean, if you just look at the political system, not just in Australia, 6 PMs in 6 years, and now, you know, now in minority government, thanks to the last couple of defections and losses, there's extreme turmoil in the political process. And the problem, media is part of it, but the problem is there's no trust left in government. We've been through this super cycle, this massive boom, and everyone knows that inequality is a problem. The rich, super rich got a lot richer, and the poor have been flatlining, and now there's this growing class of working poor who work all week, still can't afford to pay their power bills if they've got a family. I mean, this is iniquitous in a country of our wealth, and it's just a problem. It's going to plague government, and people aren't believing what they're told by these politicians anymore either. I mean, it's a joke. Everyone's cracking jokes about Morrison the whole time and so on, and you almost feel sorry for him. He's getting harassed that much.
Thanks for the talk. I just want to know what keeps you going, because the government's stuffed, the planet's stuffed, there's a lot of corruption. Why don't we just all give up?
Well, I got this great guy, this contact for, he's been in the courts for, his name's John Viscarello, I did a story about him. He's been in the courts since 2005 fighting the establishment in South Australia because he was ripped off by liquidators and lawyers. He put himself through law school and they just fought them. He's been to the federal court, the district court, the Supreme Court, the appeals court of the federal court, the appeals court of the Supreme Court of South Australia, the High Court of Australia. He's been to every court except the tennis court, this bloke. He's just a career litigant. And he sends me an encouraging text once every while. And his great line is, the only place you won't find corruption is when you're not looking for it. Which is, you know, I mean, look at the banks, the Banking Royal Commission, you know. So it does get a bit disheartening. I think that the thing to do is not, I think some people can take it too personally, and you do get incredibly exasperated when you see, particularly as a journo, when you're dealing with people like, you know, the one that I find frustrating is the AML-CTF laws, the money laundering laws. They brought them in 2006. The second tranche was meant to come in 2008. The second tranche was meant to cover, the first tranche covered banks. So you had to say, if you had more than $10,000, where your money's coming from. Was it coming from Al-Qaeda, or where was it coming from? And casinos, bullion dealers and banks were captured in that first tranche. And they've been bound by this law, even though Commonwealth Bank got busted with 54,000 individual breaches of the AML, the Money Laundering Act. So it didn't work too well for them. But essentially, the other second tranche of the law was meant to come in 2 years later. It's 10 years later now. And I ring up, once a year, I ring up the Minister for the Attorney General, Christian Porter now. Put a call in him the other day. He said, oh, there's been a shake-up. We don't own that anymore, his staff said. So it's gone to Dutton's office. So they come up with their excuse every year, and they send me back a really manicured statement saying, you know, we're following the results of a review of whatever, and stakeholders have expressed, you know, blah, 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 blah. And basically it's just to do nothing. And so it's been, you know, real estate, accountants and lawyers have been exempted from this law. Very powerful three parts of society, peak bodies, lobby groups there. They've been exempted now for 10 years as a result, because they are the mysterious stakeholders. Anyway, thanks very much, everyone. Appreciate it.